The first Kael'thari column touched down in the flat basin south of the ruined colony. They moved in standard phalanx formation, 500 soldiers wide and 6 rows deep, their crystal armor glowing softly against the brown dust of Alara 7. It was a formation designed to terrify. Every species the Kael'thari had ever conquered had either run from it or fallen to their knees. The sight of 3,000 shimmering warriors marching in perfect unison across open ground had broken the will of entire civilizations before a single shot was fired. They marched forward with their plasma lances raised, scanning the wrecked buildings ahead. The dust settled around their boots. The moon was quiet, too quiet, though none of them understood that yet. Haley Moss lay flat on her stomach behind a ridge about 400 meters ahead of the column. She had a detonator in her right hand and a pair of field binoculars pressed to her eyes with her left. Beside her, Leo Garza watched the approaching army with an expression that was somewhere between fear and dark amusement. Behind them, buried under a thin layer of dust and gravel, was a patchwork minefield that Haley and Corinne Aldridge had built in just under 40 minutes, using fuel cells, detonation charges, scrap metal, and parts from 3 destroyed vehicles. It was ugly work. It was not elegant. But Haley had not been trying to build something elegant. She had been trying to build something that would kill a lot of alien soldiers very quickly. She waited. She let the front of the column move past the first row of mines. She let the second row step into the kill zone. She let the third row follow. And then, when the center of the formation was directly above the densest cluster of charges, she pressed the detonator. The ground erupted. Dust, fire, and shrapnel ripped through the column from below. The energy shields on the Kael'thari armor flickered and failed under the sheer force of the blast. Bodies were thrown into the air. Crystal armor shattered like glass. The sound of the explosion rolled across the basin in a deep, heavy wave that shook the rocks on the surrounding ridges. 300 Kael'thari soldiers died in the first 90 seconds. The formation broke apart. The surviving soldiers scattered in every direction, stumbling over the bodies of their fallen comrades, their communication channels flooding with screams and confused orders. Officers tried to regroup, but the dust cloud from the explosion was so thick that their helmet sensors could not see through it. For several long, terrible minutes, they were blind. That was when Danny Coyle opened fire. He was positioned on a ridge to the west, with Nora Beckett and 2 other soldiers. Nora had spent the last hour studying the Kael'thari armor using her field scanner, and had found something important. The energy shield that protected each suit of armor was not constant. It pulsed. It refreshed itself every 8 seconds. And during the refresh, there was a gap of about half a second where the shield dropped completely. A half second was not much. But for a trained marksman at 400 meters, it was enough. Nora counted the timing out loud over the squad's encrypted radio channel. 3, 2, 1, fire. And every 8 seconds, 4 rifles cracked in perfect unison, and a Kael'thari soldier dropped. Down in the basin, the Kael'thari had no idea where the shots were coming from. Their officers ordered return fire, but they were shooting at rocks and dust. Danny's team had chosen their position carefully. They were behind hard cover, on high ground, with the sun behind them. Every basic rule of small unit tactics that humans had learned over thousands of years of killing each other was now being used against an alien army that had never needed to learn those lessons. After 15 minutes of precise timed shooting, Danny's team had dropped over 60 Kael'thari soldiers. Then they stopped firing, packed their gear, and moved. By the time the Kael'thari figured out where the shots had come from and sent troops to that ridge, it was empty. This was the pattern that would define the battle for Alara 7. Strike, hurt, vanish. Never stay in one place long enough to be found. Never fight on the enemy's terms. Always make the enemy come to you, and always make sure the ground you chose was the worst possible ground for them, and the best possible ground for you. While Danny's team was hitting the first column from the west, Jake Pruitt led his fire team through a network of old mining tunnels that ran beneath the southern basin. They emerged behind a HFY supply point that had been set up less than an hour ago. Jake's team hit it fast and hard. They destroyed 2 armored transports, set fire to a stack of ammunition crates, and disappeared back into the tunnels before the guards could organize a response. The supply point burned for hours. On the eastern side of the colony, Sergeant Ava Colton and her team were playing a different kind of game. Ava had taken every portable signal emitter she could find in the wreckage and scattered them across a 2-mile stretch of rocky terrain. Each emitter broadcast a fake heat signature that looked like a human soldier on HFY sensors. The result was that the HFY command structure believed they were facing a much larger force than 12 people. They diverted hundreds of troops to chase ghosts through empty canyons and dry riverbeds, wasting time, energy, and ammunition on targets that did not exist. By the end of the first day, the HFY had lost over 2,000 soldiers. 2,000 against 12 humans with no air support, no heavy weapons, and no reinforcements. Grand Marshal Vorinth stood on the bridge of the flagship and stared at the casualty report on his screen. He read it twice. Then he ordered a full sensor sweep of the moon's surface to determine the exact size of the human force they were fighting. The scan took 20 minutes. When the results came back, the bridge went silent. 12. The sensors showed 12 human life signs on the entire moon. Vorinth did not move for a long time. He had conquered 11 worlds. He had commanded armies of millions. He had crushed species that could bend light with their minds, and species that could survive in the vacuum of space without suits. None of them had ever done anything like this. None of them had ever killed 2,000 of his soldiers with 12 of their own. He sent the report to Princess Yalith in her private chambers aboard the flagship. She read it on her personal screen while sitting in a chair carved from a single piece of living crystal. She read it once, slowly. Then she read it again. Then she set the screen down on the table beside her and sat very still. She did not believe it. She could not believe it. There had to be a mistake. The sensors were wrong, or the humans were hiding more troops underground, or there was some piece of technology she did not understand that was making 12 soldiers look like an army. She picked up the screen again and opened a direct channel to Vorinth. "Send another wave," she said. 5,000 troops this time. Full air support. Armored vehicles. I want every square meter of that moon scanned and swept. Find them, finish them. Vorinth bowed and obeyed. Down on the surface, Danny Coyle sat in a shallow cave and cleaned his rifle by the dim glow of a chemical light stick. His squad was spread across 3 hidden positions within a mile of each other, resting in shifts, eating cold rations, and tending to their wounds. They were tired. They were hurting, but they were alive, and they had made the enemy bleed. Haley dropped down next to him and handed him a water canister. He drank and handed it back. She looked at him and said, "They are going to send more." Danny nodded. "I know. A lot more. I know that too." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Good." Danny looked at her. There was no fear in her eyes. There was something else. Something that the HFY had never seen before in any species they had conquered, and would not understand, even if they saw it. It was the look of a human being who had decided that losing was not an option. Not because victory was certain, but because giving up was simply not something they were willing to do. Danny finished cleaning his rifle, checked the charge, and set it across his knees. "Get some rest," he said. "Tomorrow is going to be worse." Haley smiled in the dark. For them, she said. The second wave hit the surface of Alara 7 at dawn. 5,000 Kelthari shock troops in full combat gear, supported by 6 armored hover transports and a squadron of atmospheric gunships that screamed across the pale sky like angry birds made of crystal and light. The ground shook when they landed. Dust clouds rose in every direction. It was a display of force meant to end the fight before it started. Danny Coyle watched the deployment from the mouth of a narrow canyon 2 miles east of the old colony. He was crouched behind a slab of fallen rock with Nora Beckett beside him. She had her scanner open and was tracking the landing zones, the patrol routes, and the communication frequencies the Kelthari were using. Her burned left hand was wrapped in a strip of cloth torn from her undershirt, and she worked the scanner with her right hand only, her face tight with concentration. "They have changed their formation," Nora said quietly. "Smaller groups, spread out. They learned from yesterday." Danny nodded. That was expected. Any enemy that survived the first day would adapt on the second. The question was whether Danny's squad could adapt faster. He believed they could. Humans had been fighting each other for thousands of years. Adaptation was not something they had to learn. It was something they were born with. He had reorganized the squad before dawn. 3 fire teams of 4. Team 1 was Danny, Haley, and 2 others. Their job was communications disruption. The Kelthari relied heavily on a network of portable signal relays to coordinate their forces on the ground. Without those relays, their units would be isolated, slow, and confused. Danny intended to destroy as many relays as possible and force the enemy to fight blind. Team 2 was Jake Pruitt and Nora, along with 2 soldiers. The mining tunnels under Alara 7 stretched for dozens of miles in every direction, a leftover from the colony's early days when humans had dug deep into the moon looking for useful minerals. Jake knew those tunnels better than anyone in the squad. He had spent his first week on Alara 7 mapping them out of sheer boredom. That boredom was about to save lives. Team 3 was Ava Colton and Leo Garza, with 2 others. Their job was the hardest to describe. Ava called it making noise. It meant psychological warfare, false signals, decoy positions, disturbing messages broadcast on open channels, and anything else that would get inside the enemy's head and make them doubt what they were seeing, hearing, and thinking. By mid-morning, the plan was working. Danny's team hit 3 signal relays in 90 minutes. They moved fast through the rocky terrain, using the canyons and dry riverbeds as highways that kept them hidden from aerial sensors. Haley would take the shot from distance, while Danny covered the approach routes. 2 shots, 2 relays down, then they moved before anyone could respond. The 3rd relay was guarded by a squad of Kelthari soldiers. Danny and Haley spent 20 minutes crawling through a drainage ditch to get within range, then hit the relay and its guards in a coordinated burst of fire that lasted less than 10 seconds. By the time Kelthari reinforcements arrived, Danny's team was half a mile away, moving through a canyon so narrow that the enemy's armored vehicles could not follow. Jake's team was even more effective. The mining tunnels allowed them to appear behind enemy lines as if they had come out of nowhere. Jake would pick a target, lead his team through the underground network, emerge at a point the enemy did not expect, strike hard, and then disappear back underground before the Kelthari could react. In one engagement, Jake's team surfaced inside a Kelthari field headquarters that had been set up in a large crater. They destroyed the command equipment, scattered the officers, and vanished back into a tunnel entrance hidden under a pile of rubble. The entire attack took less than 3 minutes. The Kelthari commanders began to panic. Reports flooded in from every sector. Humans appearing from underground. Humans vanishing into rock walls. Humans hitting targets that were supposed to be deep behind safe lines. The Kelthari did not have a word for guerrilla warfare. They had never needed one. Their military doctrine was built on overwhelming force, direct confrontation, and the assumption that any enemy facing certain defeat would surrender. They had no playbook for an enemy that refused to stand still, refused to fight fair, and refused, absolutely refused, to give up. Princess Yelith Vorsana made a decision that surprised her entire command staff. She left the flagship and traveled to the surface in a shielded transport. She wanted to see the battlefield with her own eyes. She did not trust the reports anymore. The numbers did not make sense. Nothing about this fight made sense. She set up a forward observation post on a high ridge overlooking the southern basin, surrounded by a full company of her personal guard. From there, she watched through a long-range tactical display as her army tried to pin down and destroy a handful of human soldiers who moved like ghosts through the dust and rock of Alara 7. She watched a Kael'thari patrol of 200 soldiers enter a wide canyon in pursuit of a heat signature. The heat signature was fake. Ava Colton had placed it there 2 hours earlier. The real threat was Leo Garza, who was perched on the canyon rim with a stolen Kael'thari plasma lance and a bag of improvised grenades. He waited until the patrol was deep inside the canyon, then collapsed the narrow entrance with a well-placed charge and opened fire from above. The patrol was trapped. They could not advance, could not retreat, and could not climb the sheer canyon walls in their heavy armor. Leo held that position alone for 40 minutes, firing down into the canyon, moving along the rim to avoid return fire, and dropping grenades at precise intervals. When the Kael'thari finally managed to get a gunship into position above the canyon, Leo was gone. He had cut a hole through a rock wall with a laser tool during the firefight itself, crawled through into an adjacent tunnel, and linked up with Jake's team half a mile away. The patrol in the canyon had lost over 80 soldiers. Yelith watched all of this through her tactical display. She said nothing for a long time. Her personal guard, who had seen her lead armies with cold confidence and imperial calm, shifted uncomfortably at the look on her face. It was not anger. It was not frustration. It was something closer to horror. She turned to her intelligence officer, a thin Kael'thari named Sorvan, who had served the Dominion's information branch for 40 years. "What are they?" she asked. Sorvan pulled up the species file on his datapad. He read the summary aloud. Humans. Homeworld designation Sol 3, locally called Earth. Carbon-based biology. Average lifespan approximately 80 standard years. No psionic ability. No biological weaponry. No energy manipulation. Classified as a Class C civilization. Mid-range technology. Moderate expansion rate. No significant threat profile. But then Sorvan paused. There was a footnote at the bottom of the file. It had been added by a Kael'thari intelligence analyst who had studied humans years ago, before anyone in the Dominion cared about them. The footnote was short. It read, "Species demonstrates anomalous resistance to psychological defeat. Extended ground engagements not recommended. Orbital sterilization preferred when possible." Yelith stared at those words on the screen. Anomalous resistance to psychological defeat. She thought about the patrol in the canyon. She thought about the burning supply depot. She thought about the signal relays that kept going dark. She thought about the fact that 12 human soldiers, 12, had been fighting her army for 2 days and showed no signs of slowing down. She had conquered worlds where entire species had surrendered at the sight of her fleet in orbit. She had watched civilizations hand over their cities, their resources, and their futures without a single shot being fired. She had believed, truly and completely, that the universe was divided into 2 kinds of beings. The Kael'thari and everyone else. The strong and the weak. The rulers and the ruled. Now she sat on a dusty ridge on a forgotten moon and watched her empire's finest soldiers get torn apart by a species that the Dominion's own files called unremarkable. Something cold settled in her chest. It was a feeling she had never experienced before. Not fear exactly. Something deeper. Something that whispered a question she was not ready to answer. If 12 of them could do this, what would happen when the rest of them arrived? She pushed the thought away, but it did not leave. It sat in the back of her mind like a stone in still water, and no matter what she did for the rest of that day, she could not stop feeling its weight. On the morning of the third day, Danny Coyle counted his people and came up with a number that sat in his stomach like a cold stone. 9. They were down to 9. Corinne Aldridge had been killed on the second night. A Kael'thari patrol had stumbled onto her position while she was rigging charges along a supply route. She had triggered the charges anyway, taking out the patrol and a full armored transport, but the blast had been too close. Jake found her body in the crater at dawn. He carried her tags back to Danny without saying a word, and Danny put them in his chest pocket next to his own, where they would stay until the fight was over, or he was. Private First Class Sam Easterly had taken a plasma burn through the chest during an ambush that went wrong. The Kael'thari had started using thermal drones to scan ahead of their patrols, and one of them caught Sam's heat signature before he could get behind cover. The shot punched through his body armor like it was paper. Nora held him in the back of a collapsed mining shaft while he died. It took 11 minutes. He did not scream. He held Nora's hand and asked her to tell his mother he had done his job. Then he closed his eyes and was gone. Private Dion Harlow had been captured. His fire team had been cut off during a retreat through the eastern canyons, when a Kael'thari gunship dropped troops on both ends of the canyon at once. Dion had told the others to run while he held the rear. They heard his rifle firing for 3 minutes, then silence. Then his tracking beacon went dark 6 hours later, and everyone understood what that meant without anyone having to say it out loud. The 9 who remained were in bad shape. Danny had 2 cracked ribs from a fall during a nighttime retreat, and a piece of shrapnel buried in his left thigh that he had wrapped with medical tape and refused to acknowledge as a problem. Haley was partially deaf in her right ear from a concussive blast that had gone off too close. Nora's left hand, burned during a fight at a relay station, had swollen to the point where she could no longer close her fingers. She had switched to her sidearm and kept working the scanner with her good hand. Leo had a deep cut across his shoulder that Ava had stitched closed with a needle and thread from a repair kit, because they had run out of medical adhesive. Jake had not slept in over 30 hours, and his eyes had the hollow, glassy look of a man running on nothing but willpower and caffeine pills. Ava herself was nursing a twisted knee that made her limp with every step, but never once made her slow down. They were exhausted. They were hungry. Their water supply was running low because the colony's water processing facility had been destroyed in the bombardment. They were running out of ammunition, running out of medical supplies, and running out of time. The 96-hour window before possible reinforcement was only halfway through. But they kept fighting. Jake Pruitt led his team into a raid that would later become required study material in human military academies for the next 100 years. A massive dust storm rolled across the southern basin on the afternoon of the third day, reducing visibility to almost zero and scrambling both human and Kael'thari sensors. Most commanders would have used the storm as cover to hide and rest. Jake used it as cover to attack. He led 3 soldiers through the mining tunnels to a point directly beneath the Kael'thari forward supply depot, the largest concentration of enemy equipment on the surface. They emerged from a ventilation shaft in the middle of the depot during the worst of the storm. Visibility was so low that they could barely see their own hands. But Jake had memorized the layout of the depot from Nora's scanner data, and he moved through it like a man walking through his own house in the dark. They planted charges on 3 armored hover transports, 2 ammunition storage containers, and a fuel line that fed the depot's power generators. Then they went back the way they came. Jake triggered the charges from half a mile underground. The explosion was so large that it was visible from orbit, even through the dust storm. The entire depot was gone. 3 transports, thousands of rounds of ammunition, fuel reserves for a full battalion, all of it burning in a crater that had not existed 10 minutes before. On the flagship, the tactical officer reported the explosion to Grand Marshal Vorinth. Vorinth stared at the screen showing the burning depot and asked how many human soldiers had been involved in the attack. The tactical officer said the sensors had detected 4. Vorinth closed his eyes and said nothing. Meanwhile, Ava Colton was performing her own kind of miracle. She had spent 2 days working on the colony's old weather satellite, a small, outdated piece of equipment that had been used to monitor dust storms and temperature changes for the colony's farming operations. It had survived the bombardment because it was small enough and old enough that the Kael'thari weapon systems had not flagged it as a military target. Ava had a background in electronic systems. Before joining the military, she had studied communications engineering, and she had spent her first career building signal infrastructure on colony worlds. She used every piece of that knowledge now. Working with Nora over an encrypted channel, she reprogrammed the weather satellite to broadcast a powerful jamming signal on the exact frequencies the Kael'thari used for artillery targeting. For 6 hours, every Kael'thari artillery battery on the surface of Ilara 7 lost its targeting lock. Shells and plasma bolts fired blindly into empty desert, hitting nothing but rock and dust. The Kael'thari ground commanders screamed at each other over jammed communication channels, trying to figure out what was happening. By the time their technicians traced the jamming signal to the weather satellite and destroyed it, Danny's squad had used the 6-hour window to relocate all their hidden supply caches, reposition their fire teams, and set up new ambush points across a 12-mile front. That night, Danny sat alone in a shallow cave and recorded a message on his combat suit's black box. His voice was calm, but there was a weight in it that had not been there 3 days ago. Not defeat, just the heavy tiredness of a man who had been carrying something enormous for a very long time. This is Staff Sergeant Danny Coyle, 4th Expeditionary Recon Company, Sol Protectorate. If anyone finds this recording, we are 9 soldiers holding the line on Ilara 7 against a full Kael'thari invasion force. We have received no reinforcements and expect none within the current window. We have lost 3 of our own: Corporal Corinne Aldridge, Private First Class Sam Easterly, Private Dion Harlow. They fought hard, and they died well. The rest of us will continue to engage the enemy until we are relieved or until we are gone. Coyle, out. He switched off the recorder and sat in the dark for a while. He thought about Corinne and the way she used to hum while she worked with explosives, like she was baking a cake instead of building a bomb. He thought about Sam and the way he always carried extra water for other people without being asked. He thought about Dion and the 3 minutes of rifle fire in the canyon before the silence. Then he taped the recorder to the inside of his vest, picked up his rifle, and walked out of the cave to check on his people. Far above in her private chambers aboard the flagship, Princess Yaelith Vorsana sat surrounded by casualty reports and tactical assessments. The numbers were staggering. In 3 days, her invasion force had suffered over 8,000 casualties. 8,000 soldiers, the finest warriors of the Eternal Dominion, killed or wounded by a force that had started at 12 and was now down to 9. Her invasion timetable was destroyed. Her shock troops, the soldiers who had broken entire civilizations with their advance, were refusing to patrol without armored escort. 3 battalion commanders had formally requested permission to withdraw from the surface, using a word that had to be translated because it did not exist in standard Kael'thari military language. Yaelith summoned Grand Marshal Vorinth to her chambers. He arrived looking 10 years older than he had 3 days ago. She did not offer him a seat. She stood at her window, looking down at the dusty moon below, and asked him a question that she already knew the answer to, but needed to hear spoken aloud. "If this is what their scouts can do," she said quietly, and her voice had the careful steadiness of someone holding something fragile, "what happens when their real army arrives?" Vorinth did not answer. He did not have to. The silence was answer enough. On the fourth day, the sky above Ilara 7 split open. The Sol Protectorate's 9th battle fleet dropped out of hyperspace in a staggered formation that filled the orbital space around the moon like a wall of steel and fire. 18 heavy cruisers, each one bristling with weapon batteries that glowed hot blue along their hulls. 42 destroyers in escort formation, fast and sharp and hungry. And at the center, like a cathedral made of war, the dreadnought SSV Cardinal, the largest warship in the Protectorate's outer fleet, under the command of Admiral Grace Whitfield. Whitfield was 53 years old, silver-haired, and had a reputation for two things. The first was that she never raised her voice. The second was that she never lost a fight. She stood on the bridge of the Cardinal, with her hands clasped behind her back, and studied the tactical display showing the Kalthari fleet arranged around Ilara 7. 600 warships. The math was not in her favor. But she had not come here to do math. She had come because 4 days ago, an automated distress beacon from a colonial garrison on Ilara 7 had reached a relay station at the edge of human space. The message was short. Colony under attack. Orbital bombardment. Request immediate reinforcement. The beacon had been sent in the first seconds of the attack, before the communication arrays were destroyed. It had traveled at light speed through a chain of relay stations until it reached Fleet Command. And Fleet Command had sent the nearest available force at maximum speed. Whitfield opened a broadband communication channel and broadcast a single message to the Kaltari fleet. "This is Admiral Grace Whitfield of the Sol Protectorate 9th Battle Fleet. You have attacked a sovereign human colony. You will withdraw immediately, or we will remove you. You have 10 minutes. On the flagship, Princess Yaelith Vorsana received the message on the bridge. Grand Marshal Vorinth was beside her, already calling for battle stations. The Kalthari fleet still outnumbered the human fleet by a wide margin. On paper, it was not even close. Vorinth told the princess that they could destroy the human fleet in a straight engagement and still have ships to spare. Yaelith did not answer him immediately. She stood at the center of the bridge and looked at the tactical display. She looked at the 60 human warships arranged in a tight, aggressive formation that showed no hesitation, no caution, and no fear. She looked at the dreadnought at the center, a ship that was already powering its forward batteries as if the battle had already started, as if the 10-minute window was a courtesy and not a negotiation. Then, she looked down at the surface of Ilara 7 below. Somewhere on that dusty, scarred moon, 9 human soldiers were still alive. They had been fighting for 4 days. They had been outnumbered by thousands. They had lost friends. They had been wounded, starved, exhausted, and pushed to the edge of what any living creature should be able to endure. And they were still fighting. Her sensors still showed 9 human life signs, spread across the surface, still moving, still active, still refusing to stop. In the last 12 hours, Yaelith had done something that no Kalthari royal had ever done before. She had read the humans' own history, not the sanitized intelligence summaries that the Dominion's analysts had prepared, but the actual history, pulled from captured data files and decoded by her linguists. She had read about their world wars, conflicts so vast and terrible that hundreds of millions of their own kind had died, and the survivors had simply rebuilt and kept going. She had read about their evolution, how they had survived ice ages, famines, plagues, and predators not through strength or speed, but through a stubbornness so deep it was written into their blood. She had read about soldiers who had held impossible positions because they had been told to hold them. She had read about medics who had crawled through fire to reach the wounded. She had read about pilots who had crashed their own aircraft into enemy ships rather than let them pass. And she had read about a concept that had no equivalent in any Kael'thari language. It was the willingness to endure enormous suffering for no reason other than to deny the enemy the satisfaction of winning. It was not rational. It was not efficient. It was not logical. But it was real, and it was terrifying. And it was the reason 9 soldiers were still alive on a moon that should have been conquered in hours. Vorinth was still talking. He was listing fleet strengths, weapon yields, tactical advantages, formation options. He was making a case for battle. Yalith let him finish. Then she raised one hand, and the bridge went silent. "Order a full retreat," she said. Vorinth stared at her. The bridge crew stared at her. The silence that followed was so heavy, it felt like a physical thing pressing against the walls. Vorinth spoke carefully. "Your Highness, our fleet outnumbers them 3-1. We can win this engagement." Her expression was calm, but her eyes held something that Vorinth had never seen before in 30 years of service. It was not fear, it was understanding. "We outnumbered their ground force, 2,500 to 1, she said. "Tell me how that ended." Vorinth opened his mouth, then he closed it. He had no answer that would not prove her point. Yalith repeated the order. "Full retreat, all ships, immediately." The Kael'thari fleet began to move. 600 warships, the pride of the Eternal Dominion, turned away from Ilara 7 and engaged their faster-than-light drives, one by one. They vanished into the dark between stars, like embers fading from a dying fire. It was the first full retreat in the recorded history of the Dominion. On the surface of Ilara 7, Danny Coyle heard the evacuation shuttle before he saw it. He was sitting against a boulder at the edge of a dry riverbed, his rifle balanced across his knees, his left leg stretched out in front of him, because the shrapnel wound had finally bled through the layers of tape, and he could no longer bend it without blinding pain. Haley was beside him, scanning the horizon through her rifle scope out of pure habit, her damaged ear turned away from the wind. The shuttle came down fast, kicking up a cloud of brown dust that washed over them like a warm wave. The rear ramp dropped, and a full squad of Marines in fresh armor poured out, weapons raised, heads on swivels, ready for a war zone. The Marine lieutenant at the front was a tall woman named Katie Voss. She had been briefed on the situation during the flight down, but nothing in the briefing had prepared her for what she found. 9 soldiers, filthy, wounded, exhausted, sitting in the dust with their weapons in their laps and their eyes half closed. They looked like they had crawled out of a grave, but every one of them was grinning. Katie lowered her weapon and walked up to Danny. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she asked, "Staff Sergeant Coyle, how many enemy troops did you engage?" Danny thought about it. He thought about the minefield and the canyon and the burning depot. He thought about Corinne and Sam and Dion. He thought about Haley counting shots in the dark, and Leo holding a canyon pass alone, and Nora fixing broken equipment with one good hand. He thought about Jake leading raids through tunnels, and Ava turning a weather satellite into a weapon. Then he shrugged and said, "Enough." Katie stared at him. Then she turned and waved the medics forward. They carried Danny's squad to the shuttle one by one. Haley refused the stretcher and walked on her own, though she let a medic support her arm. Leo had to be convinced to put down his rifle before they could treat his shoulder wound. Nora fell asleep the moment she sat down on the shuttle bench. Her broken scanner still clutched against her chest. Jake sat in the corner and stared at the wall, and nobody bothered him because everyone understood that some silences needed to be left alone. Ava limped up the ramp last, looked back at the dusty, battered landscape of Alara 7, and whispered something under her breath that nobody else heard. Admiral Whitfield's after-action report was classified at the highest level of the Sol Protectorate's Military Intelligence Division. The details of what 12 scout soldiers had accomplished on Alara 7 were considered too strategically valuable to release publicly. But the report's final line, written in Whitfield's own hand, eventually leaked and became one of the most famous sentences in human military history. It read, "Recommend reclassification of scout personnel as strategic-level assets. The enemy does not fear our fleets. They fear our people." 6 weeks later, Princess Yelith Vorsana stood before the Imperial War Council on the Kael'thari homeworld. The council chamber was a vast dome of living crystal that amplified every sound and reflected every movement. 12 seats lined the raised platform, each one occupied by an elder of the Dominion. They had summoned her to answer for the retreat. By Kael'thari law, a commander who retreated without authorization could be executed. Yelith did not try to defend herself. Instead, she told them a story. She told them about 12 soldiers on a forgotten moon. She told them about the minefield and the tunnels and the burning supply depot. She told them about a man who held a canyon alone for 40 minutes and then carved his own escape route through solid rock. She told them about a woman who turned a weather satellite into a jamming device. She told them about a squad leader who recorded a message for anyone who might find his body. And in that message, he did not ask for help or express regret. He simply stated that his people would keep fighting until they could not fight anymore. She told the council that the Dominion's 1,000-year doctrine of conquest through superior force had encountered something it was never designed to handle. Not a stronger enemy, not a more advanced enemy, but an enemy that simply would not break. An enemy for whom defeat was not a possibility. Not because they could not be killed, but because even dying did not make them stop. The War Council voted unanimously to open diplomatic channels with the Sol Protectorate. Yelith requested to lead the diplomatic mission herself. The council was confused. They asked her why. She said, "Because I wish to understand a people who fight like that, not to conquer us, but to protect 12 of their own." 6 months later, on a neutral space station in the Velen Corridor, Princess Yelith Vorsana of the Eternal Dominion of Kael'thas met Staff Sergeant Danny Coyle of the 4th Expeditionary Recon Company for the first time. She was 8 feet tall and draped in ceremonial crystal armor that caught the light and scattered it in every direction like a living chandelier. He was 5'10" and wearing dress blues that still could not fully hide the scar on his left leg where the shrapnel had been. She looked down at him. He looked up at her. There was a silence that the diplomats on both sides found uncomfortable, but that the two of them seemed to find perfectly natural. "You were only 12, Yelith said. Danny looked at her for a moment. Then the corner of his mouth lifted just slightly, the way it always did when he was about to say something that he meant with every part of himself. "We were enough," he said. And that was the truth. They had been enough. 12 soldiers on a dusty moon at the edge of nowhere, with no support, no reinforcements, and no reason to believe they would survive. They had been scared and hurt and outmatched in every measurable way. But they had decided, together and without hesitation, that they would not stop fighting. And that decision, that simple, stubborn, impossibly human decision, had changed the course of 2 civilizations. Years later, when historians from both species wrote about the Battle of Alara 7, they would argue about tactics and technology and numbers. But the soldiers who had been there, on both sides, knew that the battle had not been decided by any of those things. It had been decided in the first minutes, in a ruined supply depot, when a bleeding sergeant looked at his squad and said 3 words that carried the weight of an entire species behind them. Princess Yalith Vorsana stood at the wide viewing window of her flagship and watched the stars bend as her fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel. 600 warships, each one covered in living crystal armor that glowed soft blue in the darkness of space, slowed down and took their positions around a small dusty moon called Ilara 7. She pressed her long fingers against the cold glass and smiled. This was going to be easy. Yalith was the third daughter of the eternal dominion of Kael'thas, a civilization that had been conquering worlds for over 1,000 years. Her people, the Kael'thari, were tall and beautiful in a terrifying way. They stood nearly 8 feet high, with skin that glowed faintly like the inside of a pearl. Their bones were made of a crystal-like substance, harder than most metals, and their eyes shimmered with colors that had no name in any human language. They did not just look like rulers. They were built to be rulers. She had been given command of this invasion fleet as a test. Her mother, the Empress, wanted to see if Yalith had the stomach for war. The target was simple: a small human colony on a forgotten moon at the very edge of human-controlled space. Intelligence reports said it had a tiny garrison, basic defenses, and almost no strategic importance. It was supposed to be a warm-up, a stepping stone. The real invasion of human territory would come later. Grand Marshal Vorinth, a scarred old warrior who had led armies across dozens of worlds, stood behind her with his hands clasped behind his back. He had briefed her on the humans earlier that day. They were an unremarkable species from a mid-range star system. They were small, soft, and short-lived. They had no natural claws, no venom, no telepathic abilities, and no energy-based biology. Their technology was functional, but at least 2 generations behind Kael'thari standards. The Grand Marshal had compared the coming battle to stepping on an insect. Yalith had laughed at that. She gave the order to begin the orbital bombardment at exactly midday, ship time. The flagship shuddered softly as its forward batteries fired. Down on the surface of Ilara 7, bright flashes of light erupted across the colony. Communication towers melted. Defense turrets exploded. Supply depots collapsed into rubble. Within 20 minutes, the colony's ability to call for help or fight back from a distance had been completely destroyed. Yalith watched the destruction on her tactical screen with the calm expression of someone watching rain fall on a garden. Then she gave the second order. 30,000 Kael'thari shock troops, sealed inside their crystal combat armor, boarded dropships and launched toward the surface. The dropships fell through the thin atmosphere of Ilara 7 like glowing seeds, hundreds of them, filling the sky above the ruined colony. Yalith expected the ground operation to last a few hours at most. She had already begun drafting her victory report to the Empress. She did not know that on the surface below, inside the cracked and smoking wreckage of a supply depot, 12 human soldiers were still alive. Staff Sergeant Danny Coyle pulled himself out from under a fallen metal beam and coughed dust out of his lungs. His ears were ringing from the bombardment. His ribs ached. There was blood on his face from a cut above his eyebrow, but he wiped it away with the back of his glove and forced himself to focus. He looked around the ruined depot and counted heads. Corporal Haley Moss was already on her feet. She was checking her pulse rifle with steady hands, her jaw set tight, her eyes sharp. She was the kind of soldier who got calmer the worse things got, and things had gotten very bad very fast. The main garrison was gone. The command post was a smoking crater. Their lieutenant and most of the platoon had been in the barracks when the first shots hit. They were not coming back. Private First Class Leo Garza was pulling a piece of shrapnel out of his boot with a pair of pliers. He winced, tossed the metal aside, and sealed the hole with a strip of repair tape. He looked up at Danny and gave a small nod, which meant he was hurt, but he was not going to talk about it. That was Leo. He never talked about anything he did not have to. Specialist Nora Beckett sat cross-legged on the ground with a battered field scanner on her lap. She was already scanning for incoming signals, her fingers moving fast across the cracked screen. She was the squad's technical specialist, the one who could make broken equipment work again through a combination of skill and stubbornness that bordered on magic. She looked up and said 2 words. "They're coming." Danny counted the rest of his squad. Corporal Jake Pruitt, quiet and steady, was loading extra magazines into his vest. Sergeant Ava Colton, the most experienced soldier in the group after Danny, was checking the squad's medical supplies with a grim expression that said there was not enough. Private Corinne Aldridge, the demolitions expert, was already sorting through salvageable explosives with the focus of someone shopping for groceries. Private First Class Sam Easterly was helping Private Dion Harlow drag a crate of ammunition out of the rubble. 3 other soldiers rounded out the group, all of them bruised and dusty and breathing hard. 12. Out of a full garrison of 300, 12 soldiers had survived the bombardment. They had no air support, no orbital defense, no way to call for reinforcements. The nearest friendly fleet was at least 96 hours away, and that was only if someone had received their automated distress beacon before the communication arrays were destroyed, which was unlikely. Danny pulled up a terrain map on his wrist display. The moon's surface was a maze of canyons, dry riverbeds, old mining tunnels, and rocky ridges. Bad terrain for a large army. Good terrain for a small unit that knew how to hide and move fast. He studied the map for a long moment, while his squad watched him in silence. They were scared. He could see it in their eyes. But they were also waiting for him to tell them what to do. He looked up from the map and scanned each of their faces one by one. Haley, who never flinched. Leo, who never complained. Nora, who could fix anything. Jake, who never missed a shot. Ava, who had been in more firefights than the rest of them combined. Corinne, who could turn a pile of junk into something that exploded. Sam, who carried the heavy gear without being asked. Dion, who always volunteered for the dangerous jobs. They were not an army. They were not even a full platoon. They were a scout unit that had been assigned to a quiet post on a forgotten moon. But they were still standing, and as long as they were standing, the fight was not over. Danny took a slow breath, switched off the terrain map, and looked at his squad. "No one is coming to save us for at least 4 days," he said. His voice was steady and calm in a way that made the others stand a little straighter. "So here is what we are going to do. We are going to make them regret landing on this moon. We are going to make them bleed for every inch of ground, and when our people finally get here, they are going to find us still fighting." He paused and let that settle. "We are 12 soldiers. That is going to have to be enough." Nobody argued. Nobody asked questions. Haley chambered around in her rifle. Leo finished taping his boot and stood up. Nora folded her scanner and slung it over her shoulder. One by one, they checked their gear, tightened their straps, and moved toward the shattered door of the supply depot. Outside, the sky was full of Kael'thari dropships, falling like bright stars toward the surface of Alara 7. 30,000 alien soldiers were about to set foot on a moon that was supposed to be empty and broken. They had no idea what was waiting for them.